The orange glow of the Ohio furnace reflected in the sweat on Kimberly's neck as she lunged to steady a swinging steel beam. But her hands wouldn't stop shaking. It wasn't the heat or the bone-deep fatigue of the 12-hour shift that made her knees buckle. It was the vibration of the smartphone tucked into her work belt. A single notification had just illuminated the screen. A message meant for her husband that detailed a room number at a motel across town, and a warning not to be late. As the roar of the factory floor drowned out the sound of her own ragged breathing, Kimberly stared at the molten metal and realized the life she was killing herself to pay for was a lie. She caught her reflection in a polished sheet of steel, a woman covered in soot, holding a heavy crowbar like a weapon, while her bank account was being bled dry miles away. She had two choices: finish the shift and pretend she hadn't seen the truth, or walk out into the rain and follow the man she thought she knew into the shadows of the Riverside Hotel. Kimberly Malone slammed the steel crowbar into the maw of the furnace. Orange flames erupted, licking the air and scorching her skin. The Ohio steelworks roared, a cacophony of grinding metal that drowned out every stray thought, leaving only the rhythmic screech of iron against iron. Sweat blurred Kimberly's vision, carving muddy tracks through the soot on her cheeks. Her heavy canvas coveralls clung to her skin like a second, suffocating layer of hide. She shifted her grip on the slick handle, feeling the muscles in her forearms knot and cramp under the strain. Above the vats of molten steel, the air shimmered with a heat so intense it seemed to incinerate the very oxygen in the room. Kimberly exhaled a sharp, jagged breath, inhaling the sharp tang of scale and machine oil before lunging back into the searing glow to resume the relentless grind of the morning shift. Black spots danced across Kimberly's vision, bleeding into the crimson glare of the liquid metal. The massive walls of the industrial hall suddenly tilted. She felt her knees turn to water, buckling under the weight of her own exhausted frame. A thin, drilling ring rose in her ears, piercing through the thunder of the machinery. Kimberly lunged for a nearby handrail, but her palms skidded across the damp, cold metal. Chronic fatigue pressed down on her shoulders like a slab of lead, stealing the capacity for a full breath. She froze, terrified that a single movement would send her spiraling into the shimmering haze of heat, soot, and unbearable vertigo that threatened to swallow the world whole. Her fingers twitched against the control lever, and the massive mechanical manipulator lurched sideways with a violent clang. A heavy steel beam tore free from its moorings, whistling through the air inches from Kimberly's safety helmet. The sheer force of the displaced air struck her chest, throwing her backward onto the greasy concrete floor. Sparks erupted in a brilliant, terrifying firework display, exactly where her feet had rested a heartbeat earlier. Kimberly's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her palms went icy despite the furnace's roar. She stared at the twisted wreckage of the beam, the realization sinking in that she had nearly been reduced to a smear of blood on the factory's filth-crusted floor. The floor manager charged into Kimberly's workspace, spraying spit as he waved a greasy cap in the air. His face flushed a deep, bruised purple as he jabbed a finger toward the mangled machinery. Kimberly stood motionless, head bowed, while his screams rose above the conveyor's drone. He promised her an immediate termination and a black mark on her record if she ever jeopardized the equipment again. Kimberly watched the vein in his neck throb with fury. Every word felt like a physical blow to her face, stripping away the last shreds of her composure and any lingering sense of security in her future. Kimberly stood at the pharmacy counter, pouring a meager handful of copper coins onto the laminate surface. Her fingers shook as she sorted through the dull pennies, while the pharmacist stared blankly at the box of cheap painkillers. She counted the cents twice, realizing she lacked enough for even a loaf of bread before the next payday. Her wallet held only emptiness and a few stray bits of lint. Catching her reflection in the glass display, gray skin, sunken eyes, and grease trapped under her fingernails, Kimberly scooped up her change. Humiliation burned in her throat, sharper than the factory dust. She stepped out into the biting cold of the rain, head low. She shoved the creaking front door open and halted in the entryway, inhaling the stale scent of old beer and cheap chips. Mark lay sprawled across the sofa, buried in cushions and staring at the flickering glow of the television. He didn't bother turning his head when Kimberly dropped her heavy work bag onto the floor. The screen's blue light caught his unshaven jaw and the empty cans lining the coffee table. Kimberly watched his relaxed posture, feeling a dull, heavy resentment churn in her gut. While she had been suffocating beside the furnace, he hadn't even bothered to clear the trash, continuing to ignore her presence in their cramped, stifling apartment. Kimberly rattled pots in the tiny kitchen, chopping wilted vegetables for a meager dinner. Mark leaned against the doorframe, scratching his stomach and drawling out a long, rambling complaint. She listened to him list the reasons why yet another job interview had fallen through. He blamed the economy, the weather, and the bias of employers, while she ladled the steaming stew into bowls. Kimberly set a portion in front of him without a word, refusing to meet his eyes. His excuses merged into a monotonous hum that she wanted to drown out with a scream. But she only gripped the edges of her kitchen towel tighter. Mark tossed a crumpled t-shirt onto a chair and vanished behind the bathroom door, the sound of rushing water following immediately. On the kitchen table, beside Kimberly's half-eaten meal, his smartphone lay forgotten. Suddenly, the screen ignited with a bright flash, cutting through the kitchen's gloom. Kimberly froze, fork in hand, staring at the vibrating device. A short notification ping made her flinch. She watched a line of text crawl across the glass, obscured by privacy settings. But the sender's name was missing. Kimberly slowly reached toward the phone, her heart accelerating in anticipation of something being terribly wrong. Her finger brushed the screen, and the message expanded, searing her with an icy chill. An unknown number had sent Mark precise instructions, a room number and a time at the Riverside Hotel. Kimberly reread the words, "secret meeting" and "don't be late," feeling the floor drop away beneath her. Every letter carved itself into her mind, building a map of the lies Mark had meticulously maintained. In the bathroom, the water continued to roar, but the sound had become an unbearable din. Kimberly saw the details that left no room for doubt regarding his betrayal. Her fingers clamped onto the phone's casing until the full weight of the words settled into her bones. Kimberly quickly set the phone back exactly where it had been, aligning it with the faint mark on the tablecloth. When the bathroom door swung open and Mark stepped out, shrouded in a cloud of steam, she was already at the sink, focused on scrubbing a plate. She didn't turn around, though she felt his gaze on her back. Mark picked up the device, checked the screen, and casually shoved it into his jeans pocket. Kimberly forced her breathing to remain steady despite the fire raging in her chest. She squeezed out a brief comment about the weather, hoping her voice wouldn't crack and that he wouldn't notice the icy glint in her eyes. Kimberly stood by the window, watching Mark pull on his jacket and toss out a careless, "See you with the guys." As soon as his footsteps faded on the stairs, she grabbed her keys and sprinted from the apartment. She scrambled into her old car, which responded to the ignition with a heavy, metallic cough. The cabin filled with the scent of old upholstery and gasoline, while she waited for Mark's taillights to flicker in the rearview mirror. Kimberly gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white, tracking the receding silhouette of his car. She shifted into gear, the engine roaring as she prepared to follow his lies into the dark. Kimberly trailed 2 car lengths behind Mark's red lights, winding through the shadowed streets of Youngstown. The city's industrial skeleton loomed over them, the rusted remains of a better era. She kept her headlights off as long as she dared, her eyes fixed on the bumper ahead. Every turn he took felt like a needle under her skin. She wasn't a detective. She was a woman whose life was being dismantled one block at a time. As the neon sign of the Riverside Hotel appeared in the distance, Kimberly's stomach twisted into a hard knot, the reality of the chase finally catching up to her. Kimberly crossed the threshold of the factory floor, where the scent of ozone collided with heavy dust. On a wall splattered with grease sat a corkboard pinned with printed lists. She ran her finger down the column of names until she hit a sharp, blood-red line. A marker had bled through the paper, thick and jagged, underlining the letters. Malone. Kimberly felt a coldness spread through her chest, a sharp contrast to the heat of the nearby furnaces. All around her, workers whispered and averted their eyes. She kept staring at that red stroke, the ink that erased decades of her grueling labor. Her fingers curled into fists, crushing the edge of her work clothes, while the factory's roar turned into the distant sound of a receding tide. The floor manager blocked Kimberly's path, arms folded across his massive chest. Through the hum of the ventilation, his gravelly voice listed the damages from the fallen beam. Kimberly watched him jab a stained finger at the duty roster, scrawling her name into additional night shifts. He muttered about loyalty tests and working off the debt, crossing out her overtime multiplier. Kimberly swallowed a bitter mouthful of bile, staring at his yellowed teeth. Blood pulsed in her temples. The realization that she would have to work twice as hard for the same pittance pressed her down into the oily floor like an invisible weight. Kimberly cut the ignition, and the old sedan went silent in the deep shadow of sprawling elms. Through the dust-coated windshield, she saw the neon sign for the Riverside Motel blinking in blue and pink. Cold night air seeped into the car, making her shiver beneath her thin jacket. She pressed herself back into the seat, trying to merge with the darkness of the interior. Every slight movement near the entrance made her hold her breath. Kimberly watched beads of condensation slide down the glass, distorting the outlines of the cheap room doors. Her heart counted the seconds in the deafening silence of the sleeping parking lot. A familiar set of headlights cut through the gloom, and Kimberly watched Mark's car come to a halt by the third building. He stepped out, adjusting his collar, his face lit by a smile she hadn't seen in months. From the shadows of the porch, a woman emerged, her cashmere coat shimmering softly under the street lamp. Kimberly watched Mark pull the stranger close, burying his face in her well-kept hair. That gesture of tenderness hit harder than any physical pain. Kimberly watched as Mark took the woman's hand and, without looking back, vanished behind the door of room 12, leaving Kimberly in the suffocating void of the car. Kimberly stepped onto the damp grass, her back pressed against the rough exterior wall of the motel. A narrow gap between the heavy curtains of room 12 allowed her to peer inside, where a floor lamp cast a soft glow. She watched Mark pull a familiar envelope with a torn edge from his inner pocket. Their family savings. Kimberly watched his fingers deftly count out thick stacks of bills, sliding them into the woman's palm. The sound of rustling cash seemed louder than a thunderclap. Her fingertips went numb with cold and rage as she watched Mark give away everything she had earned with sweat and blood in the shop. Kimberly raised her fist over the door, ready to smash the thin wood, but Mark's voice made her freeze. Through the flimsy partition, she heard him laugh, promising the woman first-class tickets and a hotel on the coast. Then he spoke their son's name, mentioning that the college fund could wait a couple of years because their vacation was more important. Kimberly felt something inside her snap with a dry crack. Her legs gave way, and she slid down the wall, gasping for the freezing air. Mark's words about stealing their child's future turned her rage into a heavy, monolithic stone in her stomach. Kimberly sat in the car, illuminated only by the dull light of her smartphone. Her fingers frantically punched the password into the banking app while the loading icon spun. When the page finally opened, she saw a long list of withdrawals marked in red. The balance of the savings account she'd contributed to every week now showed mere cents. She scrolled through the transaction history. Restaurants, boutiques, hotels, all paid for with money, meant for tuition. Kimberly stared at the figure, 0.42, and felt reality disintegrate. Her eyes remained dry, but a searing emptiness expanded in her chest, pushing out the last of the warmth. Kimberly pressed the phone to her ear, listening to the monotonous pings until a teller's voice broke the silence. She demanded the immediate freezing of all accounts, but she only received a polite expression of regret. The operator informed her that the primary account had fallen into a deep overdraft, and the bank had already placed a technical block on all operations. Kimberly heard the dry figures of the debt, which exceeded 3 months of her salary. The phone slipped from her weakened fingers, falling onto the car mat. She realized Mark hadn't just taken the cash. He had driven her into a debt pit with no visible exit. Kimberly stood before the furnace again, but her movements were stripped of her usual caution. She hurled heavy ingots into the fire, ignoring the sparks that scorched her collar. Sweat poured down her back in streams, but she only gripped the iron bar tighter, pushing her muscles toward total exhaustion. The roar of metal in her ears drowned out the echo of Mark's voice talking about a cruise. She worked at her absolute limit, the physical pain in her joints becoming the only way to keep from losing her mind to the betrayal. Her face became a mask of soot, a frozen visage as she methodically destroyed her own strength in that hell. Kimberly pulled a stack of envelopes with official seals from the mailbox. One, marked urgent, contained a notice of unpaid property taxes. She saw the tax office stamp and a penalty that had doubled due to the delay. Mark had sworn to her that all the bills were paid a month ago. She sifted through the papers, finding demands from utility companies and threats of electricity disconnection. Every sheet of paper in her hands smelled of cheap glue and impending disaster. Kimberly looked at the empty house, realizing Mark's lie was woven far more intricately than she had ever imagined. Kimberly froze in the middle of the kitchen, staring at her roughened, callus-covered palms. Every minute she had spent in the suffocating heat of the shop, every breath of metallic dust, now felt like a cruel joke. She remembered Mark complaining about his fatigue while she worked triple shifts to pay for his search for himself. Now her hands were trembling, not from the weight of the steel, but from the weight of the truth. She looked at the kitchen table, the site of 1,000 quiet dinners, and saw only a stage for his deception. The house felt like it was shrinking, the walls moving in to crush the air out of her lungs. Kimberly halted before the front door, staring at a bright yellow sheet of paper taped across the keyhole. The adhesive tape on the notice bubbled in the sun, and the bold font of the sheriff's deputy blurred before her eyes. She touched the official seal, feeling the grain of the paper. The words regarding a forced eviction and the seizure of property in 48 hours pierced her mind like shards of broken glass. She heard a lawnmower buzzing in a neighbor's yard, a peaceful sound that felt like an insult against the ticking timer of her own ruin. Kimberly shoved open the tin-plated door of the office, bursting into a cloud of cheap tobacco smoke. The floor manager didn't even look up from his monitor, continuing to chew a toothpick. She slammed her palms onto the paper-cluttered desk, demanding an immediate cash advance. He slowly turned his head, and Kimberly saw nothing but cold indifference in his eyes. He drawled out a refusal, reminding her of the signed termination order. Kimberly felt a lump rise in her throat, her fingers turning white as they bit into the edge of the desk. Her last hope for a reprieve crumbled into gray ash. Kimberly slipped into the deserted shop floor, where the silence of the maintenance break pressed against her eardrums. She grabbed a heavy sledgehammer from a workbench, her palms finding the cold, notched handle. With a sharp exhale, she brought the metal down on the control panel of the main conveyor. The protective glass shattered with a deafening ring, flying into 1,000 shimmering splinters. Kimberly struck again and again, turning buttons and switches into a formless mess of plastic and wire. Her muscles burned, and every blow vibrated through her teeth, venting the rage of years of humiliation into the destruction of the soulless machine. Kimberly lowered the sledgehammer, breathing heavily as she stared at the mangled control panel. Sparks from severed wires hissed and died on the filthy concrete, leaving the scent of burnt insulation. She saw her distorted reflection in the broken monitor and suddenly realized the absolute futility of the gesture. A broken factory wouldn't return a single cent of the money Mark had spent in hotels, nor would it restore their son's education fund. Kimberly opened her fingers, and the hammer hit her feet with a dull thud. The emptiness inside her became tangible, heavy as lead, displacing the fleeting relief of the vandalism. Kimberly burst into the garage, which smelled of old rubber and rot. Seizing a crowbar, she began methodically ripping up the decayed floorboards beneath Mark's workbench. Splinters flew, biting into her skin, but she didn't stop until the metal hit something solid. She pulled out a gray plastic folder coated in a layer of sticky dust. Inside, she found original documents bound with blue ribbon, a mortgage agreement for their only home at a massive interest rate. Kimberly flipped through the pages, seeing Mark's sprawling signature, which now looked like a death sentence for the life they knew. Kimberly spread the papers out on the kitchen table, turning the dining area into a headquarters for retribution. Under the dull light of the chandelier, she aligned the bank statements marked in red with the photos from the Riverside Motel. Beside them, she placed the eviction notice, held down by a heavy ashtray. She constructed an undeniable line of accusation, where every document confirmed another episode of betrayal. Kimberly looked at this mosaic of lies, and a plan of action finally formed in her mind. Every piece of paper in her hands was now a sharpened blade aimed at the heart of Mark's treachery. Kimberly flipped the switch, plunging the hallway and kitchen into a thick, oily darkness. She walked into the living room and sank into the deep leather chair, which groaned under her weight. In her hands, she clutched the folder of evidence, feeling the cardboard warm against her palms. The only source of light was a pale beam from a street lamp piercing through a gap in the curtains. Kimberly sat motionless, a dark statue, while the silence of the house filled with anticipation. She listened to every rustle outside the window, preparing for the moment Mark's lies would collide with reality. The silence of the night was sliced by the screech of brakes at the curb, and Kimberly saw Mark's familiar silhouette in the window. He walked up the path, swaying slightly, and the sound of his cheerful fake whistling reached her ears. His key grated in the lock, missing the hole on the first try, a sound that made her grip the folder even tighter. The door swung open, letting in a draft of cold air and the scent of cheap cologne. Kimberly watched from the darkness as he carelessly tossed his keys onto the table, completely unaware that every step he took toward the hallway brought him closer to the end. Mark stepped into the living room, stumbling against the edge of the table in the dark, and at that moment, Kimberly snapped on the desk lamp. The bright circle of light illuminated the evidence: bank accounts, photos, and the legal claim. Mark flinched, recoiling and shielding his eyes with his palm from the sudden flash. Kimberly watched his face turn pale instantly, his cheerful mask crumbling to reveal the features of a coward. He froze, staring at the folder in her hands, and a ringing silence filled the room, broken only by his heavy, ragged breathing. Kimberly remained icy silent, her gaze fixed on Mark's face. He began to lick his dry lips, trying to project a look of confusion that appeared pathetic and unconvincing. With trembling hands, he reached for the documents on the table, but Kimberly slammed her hand over them. cutting off his attempt to touch the evidence. She saw a bead of sweat roll down his temple, leaving a damp track. Her gaze pinned him to the spot while he struggled to find words. But only an incoherent rasp escaped his throat, drowning in the heavy atmosphere of the room. Mark began to stammer, pouring out a stream of incoherent excuses about temporary difficulties and bad investments. Kimberly cut him off sharply, starting to read aloud the dry figures of his debt, which sounded like hammer blows in the silence. She spat out every word, naming the exact date of the house seizure and the amount stolen from their son's fund. Mark cringed, his voice breaking into a pathetic whisper as she reached the description of his motel meetings. She watched him bow his head, unable to bear the weight of the truth she was methodically laying out before him like stones for a scaffold. Kimberly slowly stood to her full height, her long, broken shadow from the lamp completely covering the cowering man. The air in the living room felt scorched, like the air by the furnace, and Kimberly felt the power shifting. She wasn't just a wife or worker anymore. She was the judge of the ruins he had created. She looked at the man she had supported for years and saw only a hollow shell. The silence that followed her indictment was absolute. A void waiting for the final collapse of the world they had built on a foundation of deceit. Mark suddenly jerked his chin up, his eyes gleaming with an unhealthy light. He spat words out like venomous slime, jabbing a finger at Kimberly. He screamed that she had turned into a formless heap of muscles smelling of grease and cheap tobacco. He pointed with disgust at her calloused palms, calling them the claws of a monster. His voice rose to a screech as he declared that no normal man would want to touch such sandpaper skin. He sneered at her work clothes, calling her a pathetic excuse for a woman who had lost all right to love or tenderness. Kimberly stood motionless while his insults ricocheted off the living room walls. She caught the droplets of spit flying from his mouth, but a strange, ringing silence took hold inside her. She no longer felt the suffocating heat of resentment that had burned her lungs in the shop. To her, Mark's screams became a distant, meaningless noise, like wind in a hollow pipe. She watched the vein on his forehead throb in a frenzy and realized this man could no longer hurt her. An icy calm enveloped her mind, turning her heart into an impenetrable steel shield against which his last pathetic attacks shattered. Kimberly closed the distance in one sharp, springy movement. Her right hand flew up, slicing through the heavy air of the room. Her palm, used to taming white-hot iron and steel beams, slammed into Mark's cheek with a dry, cracking sound. His head snapped to the side, and a whistling exhale escaped his lungs. Kimberly felt the stinging heat of the impact on her skin and the slight tremor of his jaw. A crimson imprint of her 5 fingers immediately bloomed on his pale face. Mark clutched his face, staring at her with eyes wide with shock, while the echo of the slap continued to vibrate in the stagnant space of the house. Kimberly lunged forward, seizing the collar of Mark's flannel shirt. Her fingers clamped on in a death grip, making the fabric groan and tear. She jerked him toward her, stripping him of his balance, and dragged him through the hallway toward the front door. His feet tangled, and he tried to grab the door frame, but she easily broke his resistance with the weight of her own body. She heard his raspy wheezing, but didn't slow her pace. Her boots thundered against the floorboards as she hauled him past the coat rack and shoe shelves like a bag of refuse destined for the scrap heap behind the steel mill. With one heave, Kimberly threw open the heavy oak door, letting in the damp night fog. With a powerful shove to his chest, she ejected Mark onto the concrete porch. He stumbled over his own suitcases, which she had already set out under the flickering light of the street lamp. She watched him land on all fours, gasping for air and looking up at her. The cold light caught his pathetic figure among the scattered belongings. Kimberly stood in the doorway, blocking the light from inside. She watched him desperately clutch one of the bags as the night chill wrapped around his shoulders, a final period on their history. Kimberly flew up the stairs to the bedroom, where the scent of Mark's cologne still lingered. She grabbed the edges of the sheets and tore them away along with the pillows, hurling them toward the window. She threw the frame wide, letting in the sound of the wind and distant barking dogs. One by one, his things, silk ties, expensive shoes, and glossy magazines, flew from her hands into the darkness. She watched his clothes glide down, landing in the muddy puddles on the asphalt. She emptied the dresser drawers until the last shirt vanished into the night. She slammed the windows shut, cutting off the street noise and leaving the room empty and sterile. The dull thud of Mark's fists shook the front door, making the bolt tremble in its socket. Kimberly heard his voice break into a whiny howl, mixed with pleas for forgiveness and promises to fix everything. She walked to the door and, with a metallic clang, turned the massive lock 2 full rotations. The sound of the mechanism cut off his tirade mid-sentence. Kimberly leaned her forehead against the cool wood, feeling the vibration of one last, weak strike from the other side. She resolutely dropped the security chain, finally turning the house into an impenetrable fortress where there was no more room for the lies he carried. Kimberly slowly slid down the hallway wall until her knees hit the cold linoleum. She leaned her head back, feeling the hard surface of the door against her skull. For the first time in months, she took a full, deep breath that expanded her ribs. The air in her lungs felt remarkably clean, stripped of the acrid metallic dust and the suffocating smell of the shop's fire. She closed her eyes, listening to the rhythmic beat of her own heart, which replaced the thunder of the steam hammers. The tension that had locked her shoulders for years began to melt, leaving a strange, almost weightless lightness in every cell of her exhausted body. Kimberly reached for her smartphone sitting on the hallway table. The screen lit up, illuminating her focused face. Her fingers quickly found the number of a bankruptcy lawyer whose card she had kept just in case. She hit the call button and waited for the voicemail to pick up. Her voice sounded firm and steady as she dictated her name and a request for an urgent consultation regarding fraud and property division. She tapped the end call button, feeling a cold fire of resolve ignite within her. She was ready to turn every document in that folder into a crushing blow against Mark's financial freedom. Kimberly stood before the bathroom mirror, turning the water on full blast. She took a bar of harsh soap and began to methodically scrub the deep-seated soot from her cheeks and forehead. Gray foam swirled down the drain, revealing her pale but clean skin. She raised her hands, examining every callus and scar under the bright light. These hands had fed a family, built a future, and ultimately protected her from ruin. She squared her shoulders, looking into her own eyes, where fear no longer lived. She saw not a victim of circumstance, but a fighter tempered in the fire, whose strength commanded her own deep, quiet respect. Kimberly stepped out onto the porch as the horizon began to turn the dull steel color of dawn. The night mist still clung to the bushes, but the air was already thick with the freshness of a new day. From beyond the black silhouettes of the city outskirts came the long, low whistle of the factory, vibrating in the very soil. Kimberly zipped up her work jacket, listening to that familiar call, which now signaled not just a shift, but a beginning. She looked at the empty street where her old life had been discarded and felt the cold, honest weight of her own future in her hands.